All right, hello everyone. Eric Marks here again with FindingMiddle-earth.com, and today we're going to do kind of a battle royale on raw processors. So there's a ton of photo editing software out there right now on the market. There's free options and paid options and annual memberships and standalone versions, and it's just really confusing if you're kind of just now getting into the photography industry, or if you're an intermediate just kind of wanting to improve your post-processing skills. There's just a lot out there to experiment with. I've experimented with a ton of them, and I've just kind of settled down on what kind of makes me happy. So I figured we would take a look through 5 of the most popular raw processors currently on the market, and I'll explain what we're going to do here in just a second. Before we get started, if you guys head over to my website at findingmiddleearth.com, click the big subscribe button in the top right, and you'll get a 45-minute video going through what's in my camera bag. It's all free. Just join the newsletter. And then also my 10-hour course on landscape photography post-processing, blending HDRs together, luminosity mask, basically everything you need to know about Photoshop, and I make it really easy. It's 10 hours of that. Is still on sale for only $25, so pick that up while you can. All right, so what we're going to be doing today here is we're going to be using Capture One, Lightroom, Luminar, On1 Photo Raw, and Aurora HDR. So 5 softwares, and each of them are updated to their most current version as of today, which is June 4th, 2018. And we're basically going to take the untouched RAW file and simply export it as a clean, untouched JPEG out of each of the softwares. That way we're actually using the processing engine of each RAW processor, and we're just looking at a JPEG, kind of a final export, a full quality a JPEG. Each of the files are in sRGB color space. None of them had export sharpening. I turned all of that off, so they're all the exact same settings. It's all the exact same file, just 5 different RAW processors. So this will be kind of exciting and interesting to see. Today's video will be part 1 of this. There's going to be one more video coming, part 2. So today we're just going to be looking at these untouched files. We're going to be looking at them at 100% views and 200% views and just kind of talking about the differences. And then in part 2, we're going to pick one of the files here, and we're going to actually post-process that file in each of the 5 raw processors. And then we're going to take a look at the final result on those exported JPEGs to see if it's still just kind of negligible, or if you can really see that there's a clear winner here. So it'll be interesting and exciting. So let's go ahead and get into it. All right, so here we are in Adobe Bridge, and you can see I have 3 different files here. So this file, which is the red barn, this is a Nikon D850 file. And then this file over here of this bug is a Fujifilm X-T2 file. And then this one here, so a mouth of a cave, is also a D850 file. So we have 2 D850 files and then an X-T2 file. And the reason why I did this is because there's so many theories and myths going on, and who knows if they're true or not, but that X-T2 files look better in this software versus this software. And it's the same with the Nikon D850. I've seen that some people say that D850 files look better in Capture One than they do in Lightroom or Luminar and all these other options. So that's why I have D850 and an X-T2 file, kind of an oddball in there. We're just going to kind of take a look at them. So here we go. The order here is Capture One, Lightroom, Luminar, On1 RAW, and Aurora HDR, and that's the exact same order with the other files. So before we do any zooming in, let's just look at the file right here at full view. So that's Capture One. All right, that's the red barn. Without zooming in, it actually thinks it looks really nice. The color is nice. It's not too saturated. It's got some good contrast. I like it. The next one here is Lightroom, and immediately look at that. Let's do a before and after. So that's Capture One, Lightroom. Capture One, Lightroom. You can immediately see the color drop off. And by the way, the Lightroom Adobe profile that I'm using here is the Adobe Standard. And so yeah, you can see right here right away that the color drops off. We lose a little contrast. I don't know about sharpening yet. We'll take a look at that in a second. Trying to pay attention to the shadows and the highlights. They look about the same. Looks like the Capture One version actually has a little bit more shadow detail, if you look at that. So that's Lightroom, and that's Capture One, Lightroom, and Capture One. You can see the shadows bump a little bit in the Capture One version. All right, let's take a look at the Luminar version. So there's Luminar. So let's go back to Lightroom and Luminar, Lightroom and Luminar. So the Luminar version is about the same with color, but it has a lot more shadow detail, even than the Capture One version. It's almost like the whole photo got a little bit of an exposure lift there, so that's interesting. And everything looks clean just from the initial point of view here. It doesn't look like noisy or anything. It's just got some more shadow detail. Okay, and then the next one's going to be, let's see, On1 Photo Raw. So we'll go back and forth here. That's Luminar and On1 Raw, Luminar and On1 Raw. So we're getting some color back in the On1 Raw version. And it looks like On1 Raw has even more shadow detail than the Luminar version, which had the most up to this point. So very interesting. We keep getting these incremental exposure shifts here. It's how it's kind of reading the raw file. So again, that's Luminar and On1 Photo Raw, Luminar and On1 Photo Raw. Okay, very interesting. And then here, the last one is Aurora HDR. So let's go back and forth here. On1 and Aurora, On1 and Aurora. So with Aurora, we lose the color again. It's kind of faded, which that's actually how it looked in person. If you guys want to know, that's actually how it looked. It wasn't a poppy kind of red. That's very true to how it looked. Let's see. So On1, Aurora, On1, Aurora, On1, Aurora. So it looks like the Aurora file is kind of more reminiscent of the Capture One file, where it's a little darker, has good contrast, but there's still just enough shadow recovery there, but there's not a ton. It seems like the most shadow recovery so far has been from the Luminar, or the On1 file, which is, let's see, right here. Yeah, On1 is a big exposure difference in that. The color pops, so that's On1 and Aurora, On1 and Aurora. Whoops, sorry about that. And On1 and Aurora. So if we go back to this On1, you can definitely see there's a big exposure shift everywhere. Okay, very interesting. So the colors are definitely different between these processors. Some of them come in a little hotter, some of them come in a little more faded. Let's take a look at these at 100 or 200% now. Let's just do a 200% view so we can really see. By the way, I'm going to try to export this current video that I'm filming in 4K, so that way you guys can see at least as much detail as possible. I know it's kind of hard to look at a 46 megapixel image on a YouTube streamed video, but I will try to export that in 4K. So make sure you go to the little cogwheel down below and watch it in 4K so you can see more detail here. Okay, so here we go. So here is starting back over with the Capture One file. Let's zoom in at 200% is what we're at right now. So we'll just keep it on the barn because that was my focus point. My focus point was like right here, dead center of the barn. So there's Capture One. There's Lightroom. Let's go back and forth here. Capture One, Lightroom, Capture One, and Lightroom. So I'll tell you right away that Lightroom loses a lot of texture, if that makes sense. It loses a lot of like the micro details, the micro contrast, if you will. So there's Capture One and Lightroom. Capture One and Lightroom. Obviously Lightroom loses the color, but that's not what we're looking at, because that's actually, Lightroom is a better representation of what it looked like in person, but it definitely loses some detail. So that's Capture One again, and there's your Lightroom. It just loses that texture in the wood, which I love that texture. I love that Capture One renders that like three-dimensional look. It's very kind of pops off the screen. So Capture One and Lightroom. Okay, now let's take a look at the next one. Let's see. It was Luminar. So let's go back to the 200% view, and there's Luminar. So let's see what Luminar did. Luminar is almost identical with Lightroom. Okay, I'm trying not to confuse the extra exposure with softness here. I'm just going back. So there's Lightroom and Luminar, Lightroom and Luminar. Luminar might be the slightest bit more detail than Lightroom, but it's hard to say. It's weird. It has a little more like contrast, like micro contrast, but it almost like overall it got a little softer, if that makes sense. So there's Lightroom. And there is Luminar. Lightroom and Luminar. And for the heck of it, there's Capture One. Still the sharpest. Capture One, wow. Capture One just blows my mind. It's still easily the sharpest. So Lightroom, Luminar. Okay, let's take a look at On1. Here's On1. Let's see, let's go back to Luminar and On1. Luminar and On1. So On1, I would say, is about as good as Capture One. It's not quite there. If Capture One is the sharpest, I'll say that On1 is 90%, maybe 85% there of Capture One. But it's very, very close. So Luminar, On1, Luminar, On1. And then we'll hop back to Capture One just to quickly refresh your memory. Capture One is so sharp. So sharp. Okay, now let's do the last one, which is Aurora HDR. Okay, hey, now Aurora is actually pretty good. Wow. So Luminar and Aurora are made by the same company, Skyloom, which used to be MacFun, and I'm actually impressed with Aurora. So that's On1 and Aurora, On1 and Aurora HDR. You know, I might have to say Aurora HDR might be on par with Capture One. Let's see, On1, Aurora, and don't let the faded color of Aurora HDR, you know, affect your ability to see the sharpness. I know it's a little weird since the color shifting, but it's very sharp. Okay, let me do this. Let's move the Capture One file right next to the Aurora file. Okay, let's do that. And we'll go back and forth. So here's Capture One, and here's Aurora. Capture One and Aurora. So Capture One is just a little bit sharper, tiny, tiny bit. But I think Aurora is the sharpest so far. Definitely. So Capture One, Aurora, Capture One, and Aurora. Capture One and Aurora. Okay, so I'm impressed with that. Aurora HDR is actually doing pretty good. I have just recently been testing out Skyloom software again because when they were MacFun, I had some complaints with them, so they've kind of changed management, and at least I'm assuming they rebranded their company, and their most current iteration of Aurora HDR is actually really impressive. So there you go. There's that. Very interesting test. So Capture One is definitely the sharpest there, and then I think the second sharpest is Aurora HDR. The third sharpest I would say is On1, and then Luminar and Lightroom are just kind of tied. Now again, when I say the sharpest and second place and third place, this is all just, it's not like by a ton. Capture One is pretty significant difference from Lightroom, I would say, but it's still, it's just, we're talking just little percentages here. It's nothing crazy. So don't, you know, if you're using one of these softwares, you don't have to go like trash it and delete it and get your money back and go buy another one. It's not like that. This is just kind of for fun to see how each of these processors can kind of render these different. All right, let's take a look at this bug here. So the reason I did this photo is because it really, I focused right on this dead little beetle here, and it's got some water droplets on it, so we should be able to see some good texture here. So here's the Capture One file, okay, just straight out of the camera, and then export as a JPEG here. And here's Lightroom. So that was an interesting little shift, huh? Let's see, Capture One, Lightroom, Capture One, Lightroom. So the color's got a little, the green's got a little more like electric, like an electric green in Lightroom. I don't really like that actually. But we did get some more shadow detail in Lightroom there. So Capture One, Lightroom, Capture One, Lightroom. Let's jump to Luminar. So there's Luminar, Lightroom, Luminar, Lightroom, Luminar. Not a whole lot of difference there. In Luminar, which is this one, the green's got a little bit more yellow, a little bit more toned down, which is fine. And then we'll go to, let's see, On1. So let's see, Luminar and On1. Luminar, On1. So On1 is, again, almost the same as Capture One. And then let's take a look at Aurora. There's Aurora HDR. So On1, Aurora HDR. On1, Aurora HDR. So here's one thing I'll say about Aurora already. Aurora, it's weird. It's almost like everything got just a little bit more detail. It's almost like someone put some sharpening. But again, I just exported the plain JPEGs, so there's no sharpening or output sharpening applied to any of these. But I can visibly see that these little blades of grass or moss got a little bit more detailed there. Look at that. Watch the shift. On1 and Aurora. On1 and Aurora. You can like really see the little, tiny little individual blades of moss. So that's interesting. All right, let's do the 200% view. So here's Capture One. Let's get right in on that little bug. Very, very sharp, as expected. Okay, let's go to Lightroom. Okay, so Capture One, Lightroom. So this is interesting. Lightroom is about as sharp as Capture One on this one, but Lightroom's doing its standard worming effect. If you look right here on the bug's back, like right where the light is hitting this little beetle's back, those little bits of texture are turning into that worm effect that I hate about Lightroom. So not a huge fan of that, but it actually is about as sharp as Capture One. So there's Capture One, and there's Lightroom, and Capture One, and Lightroom. Okay, the Lightroom one might even be a little sharper. The issue is it's turned into that wormy effect. So it's almost like it's just kind of mushed the pixels together. It looks sharper, but it doesn't look as good. There's Capture 1 again. I just think that looks way better. It's just more natural. It's naturally structured, if that makes sense. So Capture 1, Lightroom. Let's take a look at Luminar. There's a 200% at Luminar. So that visibly got much less wormy, but just a little bit softer. But way more natural than Lightroom. I'll say that for sure. Lightroom, Luminar, Lightroom, Luminar. The reason why there's that little like zoom shift is because Luminar by default, I guess, doesn't have the profile corrections for the lens turned on, so it's just a little shift for the profile correction. Okay, so there's Luminar. Let's hop into On1 Photo Raw here. There's On1. Let's see. Luminar, On1, Luminar, On1. That's interesting. On this one, On1's not doing such a good job in this area, this little like blurred out area. There's some weird smushing and noise going on in here. The Beetle looks great, but over here in this area, where the other processors did not have an issue, in this little green area, there's just a weird little, I don't know, some noise or something. It's a weird little artifacting or something in the greens. I don't know. It could just be the photo. Obviously, it's the photo because each one is different. On the Red Barn photo, the On1 one looked great. So it just kind of depends on the photo, which is why this is such an interesting test. So let's look at this again. So here's Luminar and On1, Luminar, On1. So On1, the Beetle looks great, about as sharp as Capture 1, but right back here in the green area, there's just something weird going on. Can't say what it is. Okay, and then here's Aurora. All right, let's see. Let's go back in. Sorry, whoops, 200%. Okay. So the moss is way more detailed. The Beetle is a little bit... It's not worming, but it's just a little bit soft. But it's not blurry. It's just not quite as sharp as the Capture 1 version. Let's see. On1 and Aurora. On1 and Aurora. So on the Aurora HDR version, all these little moss blades in here get so much sharper. It's like the little micro bits of sharpening here just get like a huge bump. And then the Beetle just turned out normal, which honestly, if we're talking about an untouched file, I would probably much rather things just look a little bit more dull and flat to start with. So there you go. Interesting test. Let's just quickly run through them again. So Capture 1, Lightroom, Luminar, On1 Photo Raw, and Aurora. Okay, so running through them again. Capture 1 is still my winner. It's still the sharpest by far, for sure. Well, okay, I won't say by far, but it's still definitely the winner. There you go. Okay, and then the colors shift again just a little bit. We already saw that the greens just kind of shift a little bit. It's just kind of funky. Some of them go a little yellow. Some of them are a little more electric green. Very interesting. All right, let's take a look at the mouth of the cave shot here. So I'm just going to zoom in. I remember focusing on this thing here because there was some contrast to it. It was really dark. So we'll just look at some of these the textures in the rocks up here. Let's just say about here. So here's Capture 1. Actually, before we zoom in, let's take a look at the wide shot. So Capture 1, Lightroom. Capture 1, Lightroom. So same thing as always. Capture 1's a little bit more colorful. Lightroom fades. Luminar, Lightroom, Luminar, Lightroom, Luminar. On1. Whoa! You guys see that shadow detail? The shadow shift in the back of the cave? Watch that. Here's Luminar, and then On1 Photo Raw. Take a look at the very back of the cave back here. Luminar and On1 Photo Raw. Luminar and On1 Photo Raw. That is insane how big of a difference that is. Just from a different processing engine, you can get that much more shadow detail. And you know what? It's really darn clean. There's like not 1 ounce of noise back there. That's really impressive. Because think about it. In order to get this, I would have to go into Luminar or, let's see, Capture 1 or Lightroom or Luminar and really have to take the shadow slider and actually bump it up. But here in On1 Photo Raw, it's just all there. All the details just there. That's impressive. Okay, and then there is Aurora HDR. So Aurora HDR visibly already is the second best with shadow recovery. All right, there's On1 and there's Aurora. Pretty good amount of shadows back there in Aurora HDR. And then On1, Luminar, Lightroom, Capture One. Lightroom and Capture One are by far the darkest in the back of the cave, and then On1 and Aurora HDR are both the best with your shadow detail there. It's very interesting to see. All right, let's do the zoom in at 200% now. Just take a look at the rocks up in here. So here is Capture One, and here's Lightroom. Capture One, Lightroom, Capture One, Lightroom. Yet again, Capture One's a little bit sharper. Okay, let's go to Luminar, Lightroom, Luminar, Lightroom, and Luminar. Now keep this in mind. With Luminar and with Aurora HDR, I'm not sure about On1, okay? But with Luminar and Aurora HDR, neither one of those softwares put any initial sharpening to the file, okay? Capture One does sharpening immediately when you import it, and so does Lightroom, okay? They put their own little sharpening. So Lightroom and Capture One have technically been pre-sharpened because that's just what the software does when you bring it in. I didn't want to taint anything. I just wanted to take it into the software and re-export it. But what we might do in part 2 as well is I'll take all the sharpening down on everything and just see what everything is at a level playing field. So I do want you to know that because each time you can see, here's Lightroom and Luminar. You can see Luminar just gets like a hair softer than Lightroom every time, but it's only because Lightroom has that 40% sharpening that's just built in right in the front. So if I went into Luminar and added 40% sharpening, it would do the same thing. But I just wanted to leave everything as is when you bring it in and export it out. So, whoops, let me get back up here. Okay, so here's Luminar and then On1. So Luminar and On1. Honestly, Luminar and On1 here are about the same. Not a big difference there. They look good. And then here's Aurora HDR. Okay, so isn't it funky how different files just render differently? Because this one, Aurora HDR, looks really, really detailed. I can really start to see like the cracks in the rock and stuff. It's really got some texture. Here's On1 and Aurora HDR. On1, Aurora HDR. Aurora actually really has some nice natural contrast in there, and that's probably helping the sharpening look as well, because the contrast always makes things look a little crisper. So I like that a lot. Okay, so since Capture One is the sharpest here, let's drag it next to Aurora and see if it's actually sharper than the Aurora file. So here is Capture One, and then here is Aurora. Capture One, Aurora. Capture One, Aurora HDR. Those are actually almost, like maybe 0.5% difference. And I'll tell you this, Aurora HDR doesn't add any sharpening coming in. When I imported these photos into Aurora HDR, I unchecked the box that said tone mapping. I had to do nothing but just import the file. So if I would have gone in and added 25% or 40% of sharpening like Lightroom and Capture One does, this might even be the sharpest file. Aurora HDR is actually impressing me on this test because these are all zero sharpened files. And raw files are supposed to be flat. I go into my Nikon cameras on the actual profile and I take the sharpening all the way to 0. I flatten the profile as much as possible. So I expect a semi-soft file when I start working. And this is, if the fact that this 0 sharpened file is almost as sharp, if not about the same as Capture One, is really darn impressive. So there you go. That was kind of a fun test, right? It's so interesting to see how these softwares just react differently. It's just simply a reaction, a process that's working in this processing engine algorithm that spits out a different result with these 5 softwares. Very interesting, very cool. I didn't do this for like a reason to like tell you guys which one to get is the best. I do have, by the way, I will go ahead and put a disclaimer on this video that I'm not paid by these companies to say anything specific about their software. I am not paid by them in general to say anything good. I have simply just have friendships with 2 of the companies who actually give me coupon codes for you guys, and in return I get like a tiny commission off of your coupon code. But again, they all beg me and ask me for feedback and to be unbiased. So before we end the video, I do have a friendship with On1 and a friendship with Skyloom. And it's not a business relationship as much as it's just a friendship. I know the people there, like by first name and last name. They're just nice people. So with On1 Photo Raw, if you use the coupon code FMEON1, it will save you 20% off of On1 Photo Raw, which is a good savings. And then with Aurora HDR and Luminar, which are both made by Skyloom. If you use my coupon code FME10, which is 10, so FME10, that'll save you $10 off of one of those purchases, or your total purchase. So there you go. That should help you out if you guys decide to go with one of those softwares, On1 or Aurora or Skyloom. And then for Lightroom and Capture One, I don't really have a relationship with those guys. But there you go. Hope that helps. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. It's a very interesting experiment to do. It's always fun to, as new softwares come out, to just kind of see how they react to different files. So cool. If you guys have any questions at all or feedback, or if you guys want me to show something specific in part 2 that I don't already plan on showing, let me know in the comments. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.